Hello and welcome to our online version of Introductory Economics. Today our session will focus on an extremely important topic of economics, and that is an introduction to markets. You often hear economists use the terms supply and demand. We are going to go into some detail about the importance of these principles and how these tools of supply and demand are used specifically to analyze markets. Let's talk about some common commodities or resources, goods or services for sale. Here we have a cotton field. Obviously, cotton has many applications, typically in the clothing or linen industry. Salmon fishing, right? We think about when we go to buy salmon at the supermarket or the fish market, how do we determine the price of that salmon? It's usually determined per pound. How much does it cost per pound? Well, we're going to investigate markets in some detail and talk about these type of markets. Corn is a pretty basic market. Corn has many applications. All of us like to eat sweet stuff, high fructose corn syrup. Corn is used as an additive for animal feed, and obviously good old corn in the cob. The United States grows somewhere upwards of 13 bushels of corn per year. How do we determine the price of a bushel of corn? How about your basic grains, rice and wheat? Again, billions of bushels of these products are grown, bought and sold around the world each year. Let's investigate how we determine the quantity of these grains produced and sold and the price of each bushel. Here's an important one. Oil. Oil is a basic economic input for manufacturing. It's also used to heat homes. Obviously, we have a derivative of oil called gasoline, which makes our cars run. How do we determine the price of a barrel of oil? All of these markets fall back on the tools of supply and demand. So here we have a pretty generic graph. We have our downward sloping green demand curve, our upward sloping purplish supply curve. On the vertical axis we have the price in the market, and on the horizontal axis we have the quantity of that particular item or good or commodity bought and sold. So the purpose of this video is to explain in detail what do we mean by demand, what do we mean by supply, and how do we get to this economic marvel we call equilibrium, and then what happens when certain events change in the market which will alter the price quantity equilibrium. Please keep in mind as we watch these videos, even though we introduce demand separately from supply, you do not have a market without buyers and sellers. So when you look at this downward sloping demand curve, that represents the buyers in the market. When you look at the upward sloping supply curve, those are the sellers in the market. Okay, what is a market? Let's define a market. Well, like we said on the previous slide, we have potential buyers. A market is made up of both potential buyers and potential sellers. So, markets can be face-to-face, they can be electronic or computerized, they can be geographically located in a small area, they can be national, they can be worldwide, right? For now, the most important distinction that we're going to make about the markets we are analyzing, there's going to be a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. The reason why we start with this assumption is because it's important to analyze markets in general where the forces of demand and supply bring us to that previously viewed idea of equilibrium. There will be special cases when there's only a few sellers or only a few buyers, but we need to build on the basic economic model of a market, assuming that in the beginning it's the interaction of a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers that will yield the outcome of the price and quantity relationship that we call equilibrium. We saw a few pictures on previous slides. The corn market, the market for grains is wheat and rice. We saw a picture of the market for salmon. We saw a picture of the market for oil. Let's talk in more detail about the four specific type of markets that in general economists analyzed. The first type, goods and services, pretty straightforward. Most people have a basic understanding of these markets through their average everyday human experiences. So individuals and households have to buy things like electricity service for their house, or food, or gasoline for their car, or healthcare services. And of course they want to buy other things like entertainment, going to the movies, or maybe going to see some type of concert. People also like to buy things like cell phone service and iPads and iPods. All of these are goods and services. The most important idea to keep in mind when we talk about analyze or examine the market for goods and services, in these markets, the demand side of the equation is made up by households or individuals. So the buyers in the market for goods and services are average everyday people like you and me, and the sellers or the supply side of the equation is made up by the businesses. How about the second type of market, the resource market? The economic resources of land, capital, labor, and entrepreneurability. These are your four economic resources. When we analyze resource markets and we use the tools of supply and demand, we have to first identify who are the buyers and who are the sellers. In resource markets, the buyers are going to be businesses, those employing the economic resources. So for instance, if we're analyzing the market for workers in the fast food industry, the buyers are Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell, Chick-fil-A, Chipotle, all of those restaurants that we would identify as fast food restaurants. Therefore, the sellers in the resource market are households or individuals. Of course, we could analyze other resource markets than the labor market. We could analyze the market for natural gas as an economic resource. But the only difference in that case is that you have to remember that there could be situations where the buyers and the sellers are both businesses. In other words, sometimes the buyers of natural gas, those using natural gas as a basic economic input to run a manufacturing firm, the demanders are buying from another business, the producers of natural gas. If we look at the last two types of markets, currency market and financial markets, technically currencies, the Japanese yen, the Brazilian real, the Australian dollar, the euro, the American dollar, those are all financial instruments. However, economists like to pay particular heed and give specific attention to the currency markets. So it's important for us to use the tools of supply and demand to determine what economists refer to as exchange rates. For instance, the exchange rate today between the dollar and the euro. $1 is worth roughly 87 cents of a euro, or 87 euro cents. Based on the market forces of supply and demand, that exchange rate is going to change, and it changes constantly. The importance of currency exchange rates will become more apparent when we study international economics. But for now, it's important to identify the idea of supply and demand having control over those exchange rates. The last type of markets are financial markets. Financial markets are made up of things such as stocks, bonds, futures, swaps. We will spend maybe a bit of time analyzing these financial markets, but the bulk of our study will be concentrated on the first three types of markets. Although economists always say supply and demand, typically we teach the demand side of the equation first. So let's discuss this idea of demand, some of the specifics, what we mean about the demand and the demand schedule. First of all, if we look up top and it says demand defined, demand is a schedule. So what we're looking at here is the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded in the market. So more specifically, demand is the various amounts of a good or service, if we're analyzing that specific market, a good or service. So for instance, the market for corn or the market for rice, the various amounts of a good or service that buyers are willing and able to purchase at a series of prices over a specified amount of time. We're going to employ our ceteris paribus, other things being equal, assumption when we examine the demand schedule. So let's talk about this a little bit more detail before we move on. First of all, the idea of price and quantity demanded. Other things being equal, the most important determinant of the quantity demanded in the market is the price. And we're going to talk in detail about how a change in price creates a movement along a specific or single demand schedule or demand curve. This idea of demand being the various amounts of a good or service that buyers are willing and able to purchase. So when we examine the market demand for corn or the market demand for rice or the market demand for electricity, we're not taking guesses and estimating if the price is this much, people might buy that much. Demand is the schedule of the various amounts of a good or service that people are willing and able to purchase at that specific price. So that relationship between price and quantity demanded. A specified amount of time is also important because some markets we analyze will have a time duration longer than others. For instance, currency markets, exchange rates, they change all the time, every minute of the day. As I'm talking right now, there are currency markets open across the globe, and the exchange rate between the dollar and the Australian dollar is changing as I speak. However, if you look at the market for new automobiles, the time duration for that specific market might be much longer. But every market's going to have a specific amount of time associated with it. Let's analyze what we call the law of demand. There is an inverse relationship. Now, I hope everyone knows, but let's make sure. An inverse relationship between price and quantity demand means as one variable, in this case price, moves up, the other variable, quantity demanded, will go down. So they move in opposite directions. The law of demand. So as price falls, quantity demanded will rise, and of course the opposite is true. As price rises, quantity demanded will fall. Now, this seems like a bit of a stickler, a point where I'm overemphasizing something without much reason, but remember, demand defined, the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So as price increases, quantity demanded falls. As price falls, quantity demanded rises. We're going to take specific energies and efforts to distinguish between the change in quantity demanded caused by a change in price and a change in demand. This will become more clear on the next few slides, but just keep it in mind for now. So, why does the law of demand exist? Let's look at 4 reasons why the law of demand exists. So why is the demand curve or demand schedule downward sloping? Why is there an inverse relationship between price and quantity demand? In other words, what's the economic rationale behind the law of demand? The first one is the basic human experience, common sense. You go to the mall to buy something and you notice that the price is much lower than you expected, you're probably going to buy more. On the other hand, when you go to buy something that you need or desire and the price has risen a bit, you're probably going to buy less. The other three reasons are tied a little more deeply to some economic rationale. Diminishing marginal utility. This is typical of the human experience. As you consume more of a good or service, as you participate in any activity, as you take part in an event, normally the utility, the happiness, satisfaction, gratification that you receive from participating in that good event or consuming that good or service starts to dwindle. Take something simple like eating a hamburger. When you're hungry, that first hamburger tastes great, makes you pretty satisfied, your hunger dissipates quickly. The second hamburger might not provide as much utility, right? Think about when you go to an amusement park like Great Adventure. The first time you go there, all the rides are unique, the experience is cool, everything is fun. But to go back the next day, yeah, you're not unhappy, but it just doesn't yield quite as much satisfaction. Going to the movies. You go see the new Star Wars, which is coming out in December. The first time you see it, it's just lights out awesome. The second time, it's good, but it doesn't provide quite as much happiness, satisfaction, and gratification. Plus, goods and services cost money. Inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So, when the price drops a bit, you might be willing and able to purchase a little bit more, knowing that the second or third or fourth bit of consumption yields less happiness or satisfaction. Now, the income and substitution effects. These last two reasons why there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, why the demand curve is downward sloping, why the law of demand exists, these two go hand in hand. Think of your shopping experience when you go to buy something such as lunch meat at the counter at the supermarket. You're going there to buy turkey lunch meat, and you expect turkey lunch meat to be $5 per pound, and you have $20 ready, willing, and able to spend. Obviously, you're thinking that you're going to be able to buy 4 pounds. 4 pounds at $5 is $20. That's your income. What happens when you go to the market, to the lunch meat counter, and you now realize that turkey lunch meat is $4 per pound? The income effect. Your income goes a bit further. You're now willing and able to purchase 5 pounds of turkey lunch meat. So that's the income effect. Now, what about the substitution effect? Assume you were going to buy some turkey lunch meat and some roast beef lunch meats. Ceteris paribus, the price of roast beef has not changed. But other things being equal, when the price of turkey is lower, you may substitute in some more turkey and buy a little bit less roast beef. Of course, the income and substitution effect would work in the opposite direction if prices were rising as opposed to falling. So for these 4 reasons, common sense, diminishing marginal utility, the income effect, and the substitution effect, we have a downward sloping demand curve which demonstrates the law of demand, the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Supply and demand graphs, our favorite economic tool. Here's an introduction to the demand graph. All right, the demand curve is downward sloping. On the left-hand side, we have the data explaining how much one specific buyer is willing and able to purchase, and in this case, we're analyzing the market for corn. So this person, this individual, is willing and able to purchase 80 bushels of corn at $1 per bushel, 20 bushels of corn at $4 per bushel. Right, you see those relationships on the left-hand side. All we did was we took those points, we plotted them on the graph. Right, notice that the price axis is the y or vertical axis. The quantity axis is the horizontal or x-axis. And then we simply draw a nice curve connecting our points. Here we have our downward sloping demand curve. Now, in general, we're not going to analyze the market for one person's demand. We're going to analyze market demand. The good thing is the market demand curve will look the exact same as the demand curve for one buyer, downward sloping. It will simply have quantities much higher, reflecting the overall buying habits of all individuals in the market. So to get to the market demand, all we simply do is add up or sum up the quantities demanded by all buyers at every price, and we will have our downward sloping market demand. So sometimes you'll see a demand curve with a slight curve to it. Sometimes it will be linear. Most of the time for introductory economic students, the lessons aren't drastically different. The implications of a linear downward sloping demand curve versus one with a bit of a curve to it aren't really that important. And if you're drawing these graphs, you're drawing these curves, it doesn't really matter which method you choose. So let's assume this is the downward sloping market demand curve for the entire market for corn. All right, so this is no longer one person and their buying habits for corn. This is the entire market for corn. This is our downward sloping demand curve. So who buys corn? Well, obviously individuals or households. We buy corn for personal consumption, and we buy, people buy corn to put into other things that they're going to make. Who else buys corn? Well, the makers of high fructose corn syrup. They need that to sweeten the whether they're making soda or they're making cupcakes or they're making candy. Who else buys corn? Well, those businesses that produce a lot of feed for stock animals. Corn's part of that. So if you added up all of those members of the demand equation here, all three parts of the demand equation, so to speak, individuals and the other two parts of the businesses, collectively all of those buyers make up the demand. So this is the market demand for corn, our downward sloping market demand curve, and it reflects that inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So other things being equal, a change in price creates a movement along a single demand curve. When the price of corn decreases, there will be an increase in quantity demanded. So you can see this taking place right here. As the price dropped, there was an increase in quantity demanded. On the other hand, if price were to increase, there will be a decrease in quantity demanded. So a change in price causes a movement along a single demand curve or a change in quantity demanded. It's important to understand and identify this because we're next going to analyze what happens in the market when something other than price changes. How will that affect our demand? So, economists are not, in general, the most creative bunch. When something other than price changes, we refer to these as the non-price determinants of demand, and generally speaking, there are 5 of them: taste and preferences, number of buyers, buyers' income, price of related goods, and expectations. Let's talk about these briefly because we're going to examine them in more detail on the next slide. Taste and preferences. Goods and services come in and out of popularity or likeness with people, right? If you think about, there was the Jordache jean craze or the designer jean craze in the 1980s, right? For whatever reason, people might say, hey, hip hop is cool now. We don't want to listen to rock and roll. Whatever the market may be, buyers often act simply on what they like or what they don't like, and what they like and what they don't like changes. So the first non-price determinant of demand is simply taste and preferences of the demanders themselves or the buyers. The second one is a bit more scientific: the number of buyers in the market. So for instance, if you think about what happened after World War II, there was a huge increase in children being born. So there was an increase in the number of buyers for all of the products and services related to babies. So the market for, say, pediatric doctors, right? And then when the baby boom era slowed down, there's a decrease in number of buyers in those specific markets. Now, when people's income changes, how much money we're taking home, that's going to affect demand. Typically, this is a straightforward non-price determinant to analyze. When buyers' income increase, we're going to talk about an increase in demand, and when buyers' incomes decrease, we're going to talk about a decrease in demand. However, look on the right there, it says inferior goods. There will be certain specific examples when the market we're examining deals with what economists refer to as an inferior good. Now, this is a positive economic statement. We're not making a value-based judgment on who purchases them. We're simply trying to make common sense or make sense of what takes place in those markets. So for instance, if we analyze the market for something like used cars or retreaded tires or generic goods and services, sometimes we're going to identify those as inferior goods. All right? Again, we're not judging people. So if you see used cars, assume that's an inferior good. If you see retreaded tires or secondhand clothing, that's an inferior good. Prices of related goods. We're going to talk about these in detail. How will the change in the price of a substitute or a complement affect a specific market? All right, so for instance, if we're analyzing the market for vacation rentals in Las Vegas, specifically hotels. Hotel rooms in Las Vegas. So that's the market we're analyzing, right? A complementary good, something that goes along with that, would be something like airline travel to and from Vegas. Those two products, or in this case services, are used in conjunction with one another. So an increase in the price of airline travel will definitely impact the demand for hotel stays in Vegas. Now, substitute products. Certain goods and services are definitely substitutes. So for instance, let's take a simple example. Let's say rice and potatoes. Let's assume that, again, in general, most people view rice and potatoes as an opportunity to consume a starch and therefore view them as substitutes. If we're analyzing the market for rice, what happens in the market for potatoes, therefore the price of potatoes, will definitely impact the demand for rice. So we're going to use substitutes and complements, prices of related goods, to examine how these will affect markets. In general, when we talk about expectations, we talk about three types of expectations. Expectations about future product availability, expectations about future product price, and expectations about future income. Before we go on to the next slide, remember, these non-price determinants of demand will create what we call a change in demand. Instead of it being a movement along a single demand curve, we're going to see the entire schedule will either increase and shift right or decrease and shift left. So we're no longer talking about a movement along a single demand curve. We're now talking about an entirely new demand schedule created by these demand shifters or non-price determinants of demand. Okay, now let's analyze what we mean by a change in demand. If we look at our downward sloping demand curve labeled D, our red downward sloping demand curve, when we talk about or examine those non-price determinants of demand, the demand shifters, 5 of them that we analyzed on the previous slide, those non-price determinants of demand are either going to increase demand, that is, shift the demand curve to the right, or decrease demand, shift the demand curve to the left. So we're no longer talking about a movement along a single demand curve caused by a change in the price of the good or the service or the resource. We're no longer talking about a movement along that D curve. We're now talking about the entire curve shifting. A shift from the curve labeled as D to the right, an increase in the demand to D1, or a decrease in demand from the curve in the middle D to D2. For simplicity, as we go through these non-price determinants of demand and how they will either increase or decrease demands, we're going to use D, the demand curve in the middle, as our point of reference. Keep in mind that D1 will therefore be an increase in demand compared to D, and D2 will be a decrease in demand compared to D. So our non-price determinants of demand. Our first, taste and preference. Let's assume we are analyzing the corn market. This is the example from the textbook. So people buy corn all the time. What would change the demand for corn? Other than the price of corn, what non-price determinant would shift the curve, either increase demand or decrease demand for corn? So let's say you picked up the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and there was an article in there discussing consumption of corn, eating corn, and it suggested that eating corn actually reduces your chance of getting a dreaded disease like Alzheimer's by 25 to 30%. So, ceteris paribus, other things being equal, buyers of corn might say to themselves, hey, that's going to change my taste or my preference for corn. You know, it's something that either I like a little bit or I don't dislike, and if it actually reduces my chance of getting Alzheimer's, the entire curve is going to shift from D to D1. There's going to be an increase in demand based on a change in the taste and preference for this particular product. Now, of course, if the news article had some type of negative report about corn, that eating corn actually slightly increases your chance of getting some types of cancer, then there's going to be a decrease in the demand for corn, a shift in the curve from D to D2. So analyzing changes in taste and preferences as non-price determinants of demand, that's a pretty straightforward, rather easy one to identify and to analyze. Number of buyers. Okay, now remember, we started at D, the demand curve in the middle there. We mentioned that the group of buyers that make up the demand curve, the market demand curve for corn, and they included people like you and I, households who eat corn for consumption or use it to bake or to cook other things. It includes companies that make feed for livestock, and it also includes companies that make high fructose corn syrup. Now, there may be more, but that's the bulk or the majority of the corn market demand. What happened when George Bush, that is the second George Bush, was faced with the price of oil at $147 a barrel and unhappy Americans because gasoline was pushing $5 a gallon? The government decided to institute what's called an ethanol policy, that is to encourage the production of ethanol as an alternative fuel for gasoline. Now, ethanol can be made of many things, but since we're so richly abundant in corn, ethanol in America is typically made out of corn. So that introduces a whole new group of buyers into the market for corn. So there's an increase in the number of buyers. So the demand curve would shift from D to D1, an increase in demand. Now, obviously, anything that would decrease the number of buyers in a market would cause the demand curve to shift leftward from D to D2. Prices of related goods. Complementary goods and substitutes. Complementary goods and substitutes. Let's talk about substitutes first. In the previous slide, we were talking about what happens in the market for rice when there's a change in the price of potatoes. So let's assume now that our demand schedules represent the demand for rice. And again, D will be our point of reference. So, ceteris paribus, other things being equal, if in general, tendencies of the norm, typically, consumers view rice and potatoes as substitutes, if there's an increase in the price of potatoes and we're analyzing the demand for the market for rice, an increase in the price of potatoes will cause an increase in the demand for rice. Ceteris paribus, other things being equal. And a decrease in the price of potatoes will cause a decrease in the demand for rice. So that's how changes in the price of a substitute product will affect the demand for the product in question. How about complementary goods? Well, let's talk about the market for cell phone apps or applications. If we're analyzing the market for cell phone apps or applications, it's pretty obvious to see that a good example of a complementary good for cell phone apps would be the price of cell phone service. So, ceteris paribus, if the price of data plans goes down, there's going to be an increase in the demand for apps or applications. So a rightward shift of the demand curve starting at D towards D1 to that rightward shift increase in demand. If on the other hand there's an increase in the price of wireless service, there's going to be a decrease in the demand for cell phone apps for smartphones. So we did taste and preferences, number of buyers, price of related goods. How about buyer's income? Now remember, most of the time this is a pretty straightforward non-price determinant demand. Normally, when people have more money in their take-home pay, they're going to buy a little bit more of everything that they need, they want, they desire. That's when we're analyzing the market for what economists refer to as normal goods. So if we're analyzing the market for corn, and we assume corn is a normal good, an increase in buyer's income will shift the curve to the right, an increase in demand. A decrease in buyer's income will shift the curve to the left, a decrease in demand. The only caveat, the only tricky part to analyzing how buyer's income as a non-price determinant of demand will affect the demand schedule is when we're analyzing a market for inferior goods. So assume these now represent the market for second-hand clothing. So all of our demand curves represent the market for second-hand clothing. That's an inferior good. If there's a decrease in buyer's income caused by an economic downturn, a recession, there's going to be an increase in demand for second-hand clothing. So the demand curve would shift from D to D1. If, on the other hand, the economy starts to pick up speed and buyers have a bit more take-home pay, a bit more income, there's going to be a decrease in the demand for second-hand clothing, a shift from D towards D2. The fifth non-price determinant demand, expectations. Now again, these are expectations about future product price, expectations about future product availability, and expectations about future income. So, expectations about future product price. Let's assume now that we're analyzing the market for new automobiles. If this is the market for new automobiles, remember, demand is a schedule of the various amounts of a good or service that buyers are willing and able to purchase, series of prices for a specified amount of time. So if this demand schedule represents how buyers feel about price quantity relationship this month, what happens if we're talking about the market for new automobiles and we assume that buyers expect lower automobile prices 6 months from now? Well, if that's the case, you're typically going to see a decrease in demand for new automobiles in the current market because expectations of future lower prices decreases demand right now. Now, future product availability. What happens during a snowstorm when people are worried about getting out of their house for the basic necessities of milk and bread, right? And the staples. There's going to be an increase in demand. Think about what happens to the prices of generators when there's a hurricane, an impending hurricane. People are worried about the availability of electricity or the availability of getting a generator. There's an increase in demand. So based on how consumers feel about a product or service being available in the future, expectations of future product availability, that's going to change demand now. So in our previous two examples, if we started demand curve D in the middle, and consumers in the market for generators for electricity, home generators, during a hurricane, or something like plywood during a hurricane, there's going to be an increase in demand now. The last expectation is expectation of future income. If you think about how the average American reacts to their overall feeling of their future economic picture. If you work at a factory and there were 100 people working there 3 months ago and you're down to 72 people today, and there's talk about future layoffs, expectations of future income probably start to drop. In that case, there's going to be a leftward shift in demand from D to D2, a decrease in demand. And the opposite would be true if people have a better feeling about their future income. Okay, it's time to look at the other side of the equation when it comes to markets. We spent some time examining demand. Now we're going to talk about supply. These definitions and explanations are going to sound somewhat familiar to you because we're still going to analyze the various amounts. It's still going to be willing and able. It's still going to be a specified amount of time. But now we're thinking like the seller, the producer of goods and services. So when we talk about or analyze the definition of supply, supply is a schedule of the various amounts of a good or service that a producer, the seller, is willing and able to make available for sale, series of prices, specified amount of time. So ceteris paribus, other things being equal, price is going to be the most important determinant of quantity supplied. Unlike demand, there's going to be a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. When price goes up, quantity supplied is going to increase. When price decreases, quantity supplied is going to decrease. So a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. Most of the time, individuals or households have more familiarity with the demand side of the equation. So when we analyze supply, think of yourself now as the producer of the good or service. We've been talking about examples such as the corn market. So now you're the corn farmer. Or something such as the salmon market. So you're no longer the individual going to buy salmon at the grocery store or at the fish market. You're the fisherman, or you're the troller for salmon. Okay? So the law of supply. There's a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. As price rises, quantity supply rises. As price falls, quantity supply will fall in check. So why? What's the economic rationale behind the law of supply? If you're the producer of goods and services, price is no longer obstacle. Price is reward. Price is no longer the obstacle, it's a reward. However, typically, to produce more goods and services, the maker of those goods and services, the producer, the businesses, has to take on more costs. So if the producer has to incur more cost, if the producer has to pay more for variable cost to produce goods and services, labor and materials and such, it only makes sense to produce more if the price of that product that the producer is trying to sell is increasing. So as price rises, quantity of supplies rises. Likewise, when prices fall, producers are going to have less incentive to make that item available for sale. They're going to cut back on production. So as price falls, quantity of supplies falls. Just like when we analyzed the market for the demand side of the equation, price is the most important determinant of quantity supplied. Let's look at this graphically. Here we have our upward sloping supply curve, which helps us see graphically and understand numerically that direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. So the upward sloping supply curve reflects the law of supply. If we look on the right at the table, we have prices. It's still the corn market. Prices of $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 per bushel. And then we have quantity supplied. So the farmer is enticed to produce and make more available for sale as price increases. The upward sloping supply curve is derived from that data and reflects the law of supply. Similar to what we studied with demand, we're not going to analyze the behavior of one producer. Okay, that would be a topic in microeconomics when you study the situation of a monopoly. But we're going to be analyzing markets where there's a very large number of sellers. So typically, we're not going to talk about the habits of one producer when it comes to price and quantity supplied. We're going to summarize all of the producers and come up with the market supply. So just like demand, the market supply is we just sum up the quantity supply by all of the sellers, and that will give us the market supply curve. Let's assume that we're now talking about the corn markets. Here is our market supply curve, our upward sloping supply curve. All right, it reflects that direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. So, other things being equal, the most important determinant of quantity supplied is price. So a change in price will create a change in quantity supplied or a movement along a single demand curve. An increase in price increases quantity supplied. A drop in price decreases quantity supplied. Now, just like demand, sometimes there are factors, there are events, there are things that affect supply other than the price. Let's look at some of those non-price determinants of supply. So, there were 5 non-price determinants of demand. When it comes to supply, other than price, what could create a change in supply? So when something other than price changes, we're no longer talking about a movement along a single supply curve. We're going to talk about supply shifters, the entire schedule increasing or decreasing. Just going to bring up these 4 to begin with because they're the most important. Producers need resources to make goods and services. Land, capital, labor, entrepreneurial resources. Any changes to the prices of these resources will definitely impact the supply curve, the market supply curve. So let's think about the farmer. The farmer needs things like what? Labor and fertilizer and capital. So changes to the prices of these resources will shift the curve. Technology. Any advances in technology will completely alter the supply schedule. It's going to be our second non-price determinant of supply. Taxes and subsidies. Most students are familiar with taxes. The government levies a tax on a producer. A producer sells something at a certain price and has to pay a percentage of that revenue to the government in the form of taxes. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Taxes are never going to be eliminated completely, but there could be slight increases in taxes or decreases in taxes, and changes in the tax situation will impact the market supply curve. Subsidies are a little more unfamiliar territory to students. Subsidies, you can think of those as taxes in reverse. So, sometimes the government takes tax revenues collected from one source and hands them back out as subsidies to other industries. Industries which are highly subsidized are things like the solar power industry or the wind power industry, clean energy, right? Why would the government provide subsidies to certain sellers? We'll talk about that more when we look at market supply. The last one is number of sellers. This one's straightforward. More producers enter the market, that's going to increase supply. Sellers get out of the market, that's going to decrease supply. There are two other non-price determinants of supply: price expectations and prices of other goods. Price expectations. Under certain circumstances, in certain markets, producers may alter the amount of items, goods, and services for sale based on the expectations of future prices of the product. This doesn't work in all cases, but we'll analyze a few cases where this non-price determinant of supply would apply to our examination of the markets. Prices of other goods only applies when a producer can easily shift between producing two products. The farmer might be a good example of this. So if a farmer is producing soy and corn, the farmer might be able to alter next growing season the amount of corn or soy based on expectations of future prices or prices of other goods. But the first four are the most important. Okay, now let's analyze graphically how the non-price determinants of supply cause a change in supply, either a decrease or an increase in the supply schedule. We're no longer going to be talking about a movement along a single supply curve caused by a change in the price. We're now going to be talking about and analyzing, examining how the non-price determinants of supply either increase or decrease supply. Let's assume that S, the upward sloping supply curve pictured on the board here, is our point of reference. So S will be our point of reference, that market supply curve. So we're either going to be talking about a leftward shift in supply, which creates a decrease in supply from S to S2, or a rightward shift and increase in supply from S to S1. Now be careful. Oftentimes students get a bit confused because if you look at S in comparison to S2, students look and say, hey, wait, that's up higher on the graph. But it's a decrease in supply because the price quantity relationships, all the quantities are decreasing. Okay? An increase in supply is a shift from S to S1. Plus, you should understand, identify that it does not matter if we're talking about demand or supply. Any increase in the curve is always going to be a rightward shift. Any decrease in the curve is always going to be a leftward shift. Let's analyze these non-price determinants. Here are the non-price determinants of supply. Input costs. On the previous slide we talked about resource prices. You should familiarize yourself with and understand that economists mean input costs or resource prices or factors of production all have the same connotation, the same understanding, the same meaning. So if we say, okay, a business has to pay more for an input, a factor of production went up in price, or there was an increase in the price of a resource, that means the same thing. So inputs, factors of production, and resources are the same thing to economists. So when there's an increase in the price of resources or input costs, there's going to be a decrease in supply, a leftward shift in the supply curve, a shift from S to S2. So if we're talking about the market for corn and we're looking at a factor such as fertilizer, we know that fertilizer is a necessary resource. It's a factor of production. It's an input. It's an economic input for all farmers. When there's a 60% increase in the price of fertilizer, there's going to be a leftward shift in the supply curve from S to S2. If we're still analyzing the market for corn, and we'll talk about a different factor of production, in this case we'll say that the cost of irrigation. If the irrigation goes down in price from S to S1, if irrigation costs go down in price, there's going to be an increase in supply from S to S1. Technology. Typically we talk about increases in technology. So sticking with the corn market, some smart botanist at the University of Wisconsin, some woman working there, she discovers a strand of corn that's more resistant to weather. It doesn't matter if it's not enough sun, too much rain, whatever the case is. It's an advance in technology. That's going to create an increase in supply, a shift from S to S1. We typically do not talk about decreases in technology, but there could be a temporary disruption in technology. So, for instance, if we have a terrible frost at a late stage in the growing season, that could disrupt technology. That would just shift the curve from S to S2 when we're analyzing the market for corn. Taxes or subsidies. Taxes are easy to explain. There's an old economic saying, if you want more of something, tax it less. If you want less of something, tax it more. So, generally speaking, as S curve in the middle as our point of reference, if taxes are increased on farmers, there will be a leftward shift of the supply curve from S to S2, a decrease in supply. If taxes are decreased, there would be a rightward shift of the supply curve from S to S1. So increases in taxes decrease supply from S to S2. Decreases in taxes increase supply from S to S1. Subsidies. Again, these are taxes in reverse. Let's assume for a moment we're not talking about the corn market. This is the market for wind energy. Wind energy. So if the government increases subsidies to wind energy producers, there would be an increase in the supply of producers of wind energy. An increase in supply. A rightward shift. All right? We will go over some examples of problems where we talk about supply and we talk about demand and we analyze subsidies in more detail. But for now, you understand the basic idea. Number of producers, again, is straightforward. If more producers enter the market, there's going to be an increase in supply, a shift from S to S1. If sellers exit the market, there's going to be a decrease in supply, a shift from S to S2. The next two are ones that we mentioned earlier, but aren't quite as prevalent when it comes to non-price determinants of supply. Prices of other goods. This makes sense if the producer can efficiently alter production between two goods. If we're talking about the corn farmer, and the corn farmer owns 50 acres, and the corn farmer was producing soy and corn 50-50, so 25 acres for the production of both corn and soy. If we're analyzing the market for corn, and we assume that the price of soy is going to be higher, then there's probably going to be a decrease in the supply of corn based on the price of other goods. This also plays into the idea of expectations of future prices. Thinking about future business decisions. If the farmer's been planting 50% corn and 50% soy, and the farmer expects future prices of corn to be greater, there's going to be an increase in the supply of corn. Now, of course, 5 and 6 don't apply to every situation. Let's wrap up this video by going right back to where we started. On the vertical axis, we have the price in the markets. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity in the markets. This could be the graph of any market we're analyzing. We have our green downward sloping demand curve. It shows the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Ceteris paribus, other things being equal, the most important determinant of quantity demanded is the price in the market. A change in price creates a movement along that green curve, right? What would shift that curve are 5 non-price determinants of demand. Then we have our upward sloping supply curve. It shows the direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. Ceteris paribus, the most important determinant of quantity supplied is the price in the markets. A change in price would create a movement along the supply curve, but there are 6 non-price determinants of supply. When we bring supply and demand together, we come to this temporary resting place called equilibrium. The whole entire purpose of studying supply and demand as tools to analyze markets is to get to this point. The idea that together, the market forces of buyers and sellers, buyers trying to maximize utility, sellers trying to maximize profit, as if led by the invisible hand, the famous saying of Adam Smith, we get to this temporary resting point where we have a price and quantity relationship. Now, we did all this work to explain how we get to equilibrium. In the future videos, we're going to explain what happens to equilibrium when we have events related to our non-price determinants of supply and demand. What happens to that price-quantity relationship? Because when it's all said and done, that price-quantity relationship in the market is the entire reason we have supply and demand as tools to analyze markets to begin with.